All right. How's everybody doing? We are live. Welcome to the Calibrated Roundtable number 3. We have a lot to talk about since the last roundtable. Obviously, there was the terror attack in Moscow. We have had a renewal of Russian infrastructure strikes against Ukraine. We've seen a more consistent movement from the Russian military in the SMO area. So we have a lot to cover today. And starting off, Dr. Snektron is joining me. You guys might remember him from a previous roundtable. Other people said that they are going to join. Unfortunately, I set this roundtable up very, very late. I wanted to get some content out for you guys. It's been a little dry this week from me. But without further ado, Dr. Sneckle, how are you doing today?
Hey.
There's a lot going on. Do you have a particular topic that you would like to start on? Wait, we can.
No, I mean, it's your show, man. Go ahead.
All right. Then I would like to hear your opinion on the terror attack. Obviously, it's your opinion, whatever you claim, and it might not necessarily even be your opinion. I'm not asking for definitive answers, but more what this means going forward for the Russians, what this means going forward for the Ukrainians and the West in totality.
Oh, the terror attack. So this is obviously, we're going to the most controversial topic first, I guess. By the way, so what is your opinion? First of all, like you and the people you talk to, what is your opinion? That it was Ukraine or it was ISIS or?
Like, so, in my personal opinion, I fully believe that ISIS was involved. I don't think that it was any other group that actually kinetically, attacked this concert hall. But I'm not necessarily convinced that it was just a random ISIS attack. I think the timing was very coincidental with things that were happening on the Ukrainian front. I think the timing was coincidental with whatever happened with Newland, whether that was planned, scheduled. I'm not sure. The timing was just very coincidental. And at the end of the day, though, my whole point that I make about this is it doesn't really matter what the truth is. The Russians are going to say whatever they want to say to get, further their means. The Ukrainians are going to say whatever they're going to say, and the U.S. is going to say whatever they're going to say. The fact that the U.S. came out immediately and said that Ukraine was not involved before literally the bodies or the building was cold. I mean, the building was on fire when they said this. I have extreme issue with that. It seems like they had a planned statement ahead of time. Whether they just knew it because the attack was coming or they knew it because of what potentially nefarious actions were planned behind this. It's just extremely suspicious to me.
Okay, so interesting. So we actually have somewhat different opinions on this, but I'm going to lay out a couple of different factors. I mean, nothing can be said definitively, but like, for example, okay, so this is ISIS, but not ordinary ISIS. This is ISIS Khorasan.
Yeah.
Right. ISIS Khorasan. Now, this is interesting because, again, what does ISIS Khorasan actually do? They are basically trapped in Afghanistan. There's no really easy way to get out.
Yeah.
And they're currently fighting an insurgency against the Taliban. And that fact alone actually creates some interesting conditions. For example, the Taliban's they've been, for people who have not been following Afghanistan since the collapse of the government, the former government, they've been faced with almost daily terror attacks, and ISIS-K is actually quite potent in Afghanistan. It's very odd though that they would try to run recruitment in Tajikistan, considering that Tajikistan has, their government is they're very anti-Islamist and they surveil Islamists quite heavily. The thing is, there is some talk about ISIS-K actually offering some kind of contact or some kind of mercenary services to other intel agencies. I mean, Pakistan's ISI supported the Taliban for so many years, but then when the Taliban took over Afghanistan, they kind of lost control of them. And all of a sudden, I hear rumors that they're talking to ISIS-K, right? Because the thing about Afghanistan, it is just overrun with all kinds of militant groups, lawless border regions. Like anybody can sort of be contracted or hired to do anything. So the fact that they may be ISIS-K doesn't say a lot. And besides, the other thing about ISIS, the way that you can get membership is all you got to do is make a video of yourself pledging allegiance to ISIS, and all of a sudden you're in, right? That's how all these like random attacks happen with ISIS. Some guy says, I'm a member of ISIS, I pledge allegiance to the Caliph, or pledge allegiance to the ISIS flag, and here we go. So the fact that it may be ISIS doesn't say a whole lot to me. That the timing of this is actually a lot more interesting.
I just wanted to jump in real fast, Sneckle, and say that I totally agree with what you're saying right now, that the ISIS-K implication, that what I said, that it was likely ISIS-K, is that means nothing. That could mean any Muslim-looking individual who, thinks that they're part of ISIS, and ISIS is going to claim that. So go ahead. Right.
So, yeah. So this is the timing, and then the other thing I kind of talked to you on Twitter privately before this is like, it just seems like the U.S. to a certain extent has lost control of Ukraine. Right? The Zelensky was like groomed to be America's guy in Ukraine, and all of a sudden, like Nuland's going over there trying to paper over the difference between Zelensky and Zelensky, and Zelensky didn't even meet with her. This is the thing. This is people on our side set up Nuland to be this like evil big bad, and to a large extent she is. But she went over there and she got put in her place. I mean, Zelensky didn't even bother to meet with her. Sent that masturbator, Ministry of Defense guy, Umerov, sent him over to meet with her and basically told her to get stuffed. I mean, and in this regard, like I think that either Zelensky, Budanov, any number of decision makers in Ukraine, they have incentive to escalate with Russia. They would be making these kinds of links. I mean, and if you remember the leak, right? If you remember the leak from the Pentagon, they talked about the GUR trying to establish contacts in Syria, trying to establish contacts with militant groups that offer like territory for them to conduct basically terrorist attacks on Russian forces, right?
Yeah.
Basically insert themselves in other conflicts where Russia is currently stationed to have opportunity to attack Russians. I mean, this kind of stuff.
They did this in the Sudan as well, right?
Yeah, they talked about that. So, like, all this together is like, why the GUR like wouldn't have a hand in this? Like, it seems very likely that they could have either just used the. I mean, there are two possibilities. One, they actually made contact with ISIS-K. And they said, "Hey, we'll pay you some money if you just like do this like mercenary work for us," or they just got a bunch of guys, just recruit them and just have them claim ISIS-K. It's not like ISIS-K is going to turn down the credit, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
no, I agree with that. I'm just very careful to instantly. I mean, I think it's very disingenuous of all the people who were instantly coming out and saying, it was Ukraine. It was a false flag. It was the State Department. It was ISIS-K alone. And I just have a very hard time with people that instantly came out and made a claim like that because just you don't know, right? It could definitely have been exactly what the Russians are saying, and it also could have been exactly what the U.S. State Department was saying. You just don't know in like. That amount of time. You just cannot possibly know enough to make an actual claim. But I do agree. I think that the connections and the modum operandi just match Ukrainian intelligence very, very closely. If they didn't do it, they definitely look very guilty of doing it. So I do agree with you there. Armchair, how are you doing today?
Doing all right. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. I guess I will toss this question over to you if you would like to answer. What do you make of the Moscow attack now 2 weeks after, or 10 days after, or whatever?
Well, I've written a couple of posts on it. I mean, I think it. I think to the extent that ISIS was involved, it was because the Ukrainian GUR was wearing like a mask. It's the way I put it. It's not it would not be too difficult. I mean, from what I understand, several of the attackers had close links to Ukraine. The attackers tried to flee to Ukraine. The GUR appears to have coordinated, funded, and equipped the attack. And I mean, it seems to me like they basically recruited some, I guess, kind of sort of jihadists. These guys didn't strike me as being very committed jihadists but some plausibly deniable jihadists to actually do the deed.
Yeah. I said this the second it happened. I said it was very weird to me that these guys went into this building, and then first off, they did not fire all of the ammunition that they had. They entered the building very quickly, got into the room that they started the fire, and then they exited the building rather quickly. I think the whole thing took 13 minutes in totality, right? So this was a very, very speedy terror attack. I feel like they could have killed a ton more people if they would have posted up and continued firing and potentially fought off the police forces for a while. And in my personal experience, outside of lone wolf attacks in some areas, which is, again, not necessarily a normal trained ISIS individual, the result of these attacks is usually martyrdom. That is the end goal, all right, kind of. And the fact that they escaped and then made their way towards Ukraine was very, very suspicious to me. And again, the U.S. State Department jumping out right away and saying that it was not Ukraine is also incredibly suspicious. So I tend to agree with both of you. It just seems like the perfect way to cause some sort of chaos, potentially before the elections, which is when I think it was supposed to happen. And then it was delayed. It causes the chaos, and it has some realm of plausible deniability for Ukraine because, they can just claim that this was an ISIS attack. And then if Russia claims that it was Ukraine, they're just going to say that, they're just going to play the victim card. So it all makes sense, right? That, to me, at least logically. Do you guys agree? I've already asked you what you think, but
yeah, who benefits? I mean, Ukraine certainly benefits from this.
Yeah,
I mean, this is the way that. I mean, this is something that people have been talking about. Like, if they lose on the battlefield, like, what are they going to turn to? I mean, the same way ISIS did when it started losing is like there's going to hit soft targets, right?
Yeah.
And I think honestly, like this eventuality should have been taken way more seriously. But people are they're very complacent, and this is the result of it. And hopefully things will change, at least for a little. Hopefully things will change with the internal security situation. I mean, Russia's been very lax on it and trying to present this air of normalcy, right? Russia is still a very normal society. There aren't like martial law in regions and stuff like that. It's just it, and this kind of thing. Like, even when there was a very credible warning, I mean, even though it's from the U.S., like, it's still. I think that those kinds of warnings should be taken seriously because we are in this mode now, right, where Ukraine or whomever is trying to pick apart, Russian society, that the parts of it that look soft, right? If the front is too hard, they're going to move on to civilians. Yeah, and this is the way it always goes.
And I fully agree with you. I think that we're going to see more of this. I think it's going to get worse and more desperate, and it's just going to continue and continue and continue because Ukraine is not. Ukrainian intelligence, Ukrainian political leadership does not seem like they want negotiations at all. It doesn't seem like they're willing to back down. They're going to take this thing to the very end. And that is one of, gray warfare, right? That's one of the means to achieve some sort of results.
If I could jump in here momentarily. I also wrote another post on this, comparing these circumstances to, noting two things. One, noting that ISIS K seems to operate primarily against American adversaries, and then comparing the circumstances to the bombings in Kerman in Iran earlier this year on January 3rd, where about 100 people were killed, 96 people were killed, and this was the circumstances of the attacks were very similar. Down to the State Department issuing a useless warning. Basically telling the Iranians there was an attack happened. telling the Iranians there's a plot afoot, essentially, but apparently not giving them much useful detail. And lo and behold, the plot happens. And it occurred to me that, given ISIS-K's rather interesting targeting priorities, I started thinking about, a little bit about the and some allegations that they were perhaps being operating in concert with Western interests. I started thinking a little bit about the circumstances of our withdrawal from Afghanistan and the circumstances under which we got out of Afghanistan. And part of that was there was a long-running effort, very long-running, several years worth of negotiations and attempts to peel off one or the other of the Taliban factions, including negotiations with the Haqqani network, which at the time, this was a long time ago, but I thought that was kind of behind the pale because the Haqqanis they remain bad dudes. They were the most extreme of the Taliban factions. They contributed fighters directly to ISIS. Many of their sort of alumni went on to, I guess, ostensibly form ISIS-K. But there have been, at least to my understanding, direct contacts between Western U.S. intelligence and the Haqqani network in the context of attempting to negotiate a resolution to the Afghan war, 10 years ago, in the last decade. And it sort of tickled in the back of my mind, like those contacts, especially because ISIS-K, they fight the Taliban. And it sort of tickled in the back of my mind, those contacts may not, they may not have led to the resolution we want in Afghanistan, but I suspect there's still fingers out there that can, there's still fingers out there, I'd put it. And there may still be levers that can be pulled.
Yeah, I mean that's what I mentioned earlier. I mean, in Afghanistan, the Russian embassy was actually bombed by ISIS-K, right? So they're still active. I mean, terrorism, like these frequent bombing attacks and like just gun attacks on civilians and police, they happen very regularly still in Afghanistan. And I mentioned earlier that it seems like Pakistan's ISI has like shifted from backing the Taliban to backing ISIS-K, or at least having some contacts with ISIS-K because they can no longer influence the Taliban because the Taliban actually have power now, right? And it's very funny how like former friends, I mean the Pakistanis, they actually coped a lot when the Taliban took over. They said, hey, like we know these guys, we can work with them, we talked to them before, but power changes people, right? All of a sudden when you're king, you don't have to listen to your former handlers because you're the boss now, right? Same with Zelensky, right? So yeah. So now the external intelligence agency, they're working with other militant groups, including ISIS-K, to try to put some kind of pressure on the Taliban. I mean, the morale when you're dealing with these small insurgent groups, morality really doesn't figure into it, unfortunately. It's just a question of power and then what levers you have to pull.
I mean, it should, but it didn't. Lest we forget, the United States backed the Khmer Rouge quite strongly during the 1980s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask a follow-up question with your guys' bias, I guess, towards who was behind this act. I think we're all sort of in tentative agreement about the puppeteers and what exactly occurred. Do we think that this is going to have ramifications on the U.S.-Ukrainian relationship? From what I'm hearing from Ukrainian sources, like not like government officials or anything like that, it really does seem like the whole I don't know, just the communication levels, the working together is starting to really collapse with the aid not being delivered and with a bunch of other things going on. I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts.
Well, I think we touched on this before with Newland, right? Getting the cold shoulder treatment from Zelensky, and I think at this point it's very clear that the Ukraine has a certain degree of agency. They may be acting unhinged, but it's something where the U.S. if the U.S. absolutely wanted to, I think it could really press on Ukraine and force them to do things, but it hasn't reached that point. And it's sort of like in Israel, where like Bibi can just continue to do his shit even when being condemned by the U.S. political class. At this point, I think it is in Ukraine's interest to escalate, because if they attract some kind of like horrendous attack from Russia, that can put them in the news again, and that would actually raise the stakes for the West again, and perhaps that might get a Western troop deployment because people are talking about that, right? All this is in the incentive package for Ukraine to escalate. For the U.S., like the U.S. is still, I think, for the most part, is behaving as a distant player. Like, it's not trying to get too involved. It's trying to force Ukraine and force Europe to support Ukraine and empty out everything it has for Ukraine, while trying to reserve its own capabilities. This again, at some point, this is going to have to be confronted. But right now, like, Ukraine's trying to do as much as they can get away with, and telling, if the U.S. complains about it, like they complain about infrastructure strikes on Russian soil, they complain, they warn Russia about like terror strikes or whatever. They don't, like, Ukraine doesn't give a fuck anymore, right? They're going to go for broke, and we have to understand the kind of mental state that the Ukrainian leadership is in right now.
Do you think that this negatively impacts things like potentially Taurus missile transfer, ATACMS missile transfer? Because if you have an unhinged state that is using your weaponry in a inappropriate, or in a way that the U.S. might deem inappropriate in terms of international security, is this a Israel situation where Ukraine can act however they want and go against whatever wishes and still be supported to the ends because the Ukraine project is that important? Or is this a proxy that can be dropped and forgotten about if they begin to act with their own free agency?
I mean, it's a proxy that can be dropped, but they're not doing it because all the positions that they took in politically for the West, like the way they talked Ukraine up, it's all in public. So the leaders of the West, because they have an open society, because they have this debate in public, they can't easily walk anything back, right? So it becomes a humiliation if all of a sudden this guy they promoted as the beacon of democracy in Eastern Europe, all of a sudden you say, oh my God, this guy's unhinged. He's gonna like plant a dirty bomb in Rostov or something. Like, that's you can't spring that on people, and it'd be a huge embarrassment, humiliation for all Western governments that they do that. So they have to keep up this facade, like, well, even when aid is stalled, they have to keep this facade of like, oh, we're going to support you. And Ukraine, because it's receiving less and less aid, so it feels less obliged to obey whatever they have to say. So in this sense, like, I mean, again, like with the Taurus missiles, that specifically is Germany, I can tell you, based on what I've heard from some like think tankies, like, yeah, that does figure a lot into the calculation. For example, like, I mean, people are worried, like legitimately worried that Ukraine might try like a dirty bomb attack, and they made kind of off the like outlandish, they basically made outlandish queries about like how they can, like, how to disassemble these missiles. So like when you start asking those questions, like, nobody's like, why would you ask whether you can like remove a warhead from a Taurus missile? Like, who asked that? Unless you're trying to like put in something extra on your own, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well,
in general, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think the Ukraine situation right now puts me in mind of an old saying, which is, okay, if I owe you $1,000, that's my problem. If I owe you $1 million, that's your problem. That's what's going on right now.
Now, I'm just, I have a very, very uneasy feeling about the future of this conflict. I believe that over the next 6 months to a year, we are going to see the Ukrainian military degrade severely in terms of artillery, air defense. We're already seeing it, and manpower, quality, experienced manpower. I know that we're talking about dirty bombs and stuff. Do you guys think that Ukraine will do something that dramatic? And what do you think the end goal of doing something that dramatic or, extreme could potentially be?
I mean, I'm personally having a hard time believing they would resort to a dirty bomb, among other things, because I don't think it would accomplish much for them. It would certainly piss off the Russians. It would piss them off a great deal, but it wouldn't, as far as meaningful damage inflicted, it wouldn't inflict a lot of meaningful damage, and and there would be hell to pay.
Does the terror attack in Moscow yield any significant damage?
Well, it certainly got the pro-Ukrainian base fired up.
When the dirty bomb, though?
They need those.
I mean, I guess it could. Well, like I said, I'm just having a hard time. Well, and also, I mean, here's the other thing, which is that we've already seen Western the Ukraine's Western sponsors write off this terror attack in Moscow as the work of ISIS, even though I mean the Ukraine certainly took a great deal of pleasure in it, and their support and and well, here's the thing: a dirty bomb attack. Let's say the Ukrainians put together a dirty bomb. I don't think there's any conceivable way that you're going to see the State Department up there saying, "Oh, this is definitely ISIS. This Taurus missile loaded with a radioactive warhead. That was definitely the work of ISIS."
At this point, I wouldn't be surprised if the State Department literally said, "This has nothing to do with Ukraine." Like,
I mean, they might try, but it would be facial.
As the mushroom cloud is ascending into the troposphere, we get the this was definitely not Ukraine.
I'm sure they might try, but they would get like there's limits to there is a limit to even there's a limit to what people will believe. And
Doctor, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, the question is like, why wouldn't you try it? Like, I mean, if the end goal of your country is that you will lose and your population is going to collapse, and we've seen the damage being done to Ukrainian demography through flight and also mass death. Like, why wouldn't you? I mean, this is the part where you get into the question of ideology, and like the people around the Zelensky is particularly, Budanov, as they are nationalist death cultists. I mean, there are people who are willing to. I mean, look how he sacrificed people attacking the border just for propaganda victory to fire up NATO for a few days to disrupt the election, right? Like, he doesn't give a fuck, right? And that may also create enough of a distraction to take your eyes off, anything that was planned, deeper inside Russia. Think about it. I mean, these are kind of the guy. Like, let's remember, Budanov is a guy who personally led a DRG attack into Crimea in 2016. Like, he's that kind of mad motherfucker. So, like, yeah, like, why wouldn't he try it if he had the means, right? If they thought they could get away with it, if they thought they could, they can pass it off as ISIS. Let's hear a report of like ISIS stealing like some nuclear material or some shit from like some old Soviet reactor, something like that, and then all of a sudden, there's a dirty bomb attack. Like there any number of things can happen if they think they can plausibly get away with it, and they think that they can do it without too much reputational damage. They'll go ahead and do it. And I think it's also prudent for Russia to at this point to assume that the worst cases can happen, because the only way that you can be reasonably secure is to prepare for the worst case scenarios, right? And this is becoming a problem where, like, we're now uncovering like the various ways in which the SBU and GUR recruit people inside Russia. I mean, it's actually astounding just how like low tier and just like how inconsequential some of these operations are, but yet they still do them. For example, like there's a lady that got arrested for arson, trying to set fire to a government building. Why did she do it? It's because Ukraine stole her money and they basically extorted her, like, hey, we'll give back your money if you go and burn this building, right? Like they're weaponizing like the call center scams. So like all this shit, like you think like this stuff like literally does not matter, but yet they're still doing it, and they try to have the pushing in every little way that they can, and the only way that you encounter this is just you have to just comprehensively make an effort on every level to improve the internal security of the state. And I don't think that the Crocus Hall attack was like a one-off. Like this is going to be something Russia has prepared for in the future.
I was going to ask, with that warning that came out, we did see a Russian security service operation that resulted in the deaths of multiple individuals that the Russian Federation calls Islamic extremists. Do you think that there could have been multiple terrorist attacks planned for around that time? And do you think that the Russians did act on that information, but they just didn't get all of the cells because potentially they did not have all of the information that they needed to possess?
I mean, that's also very logical.
Sorry to cut you off here, but I think you're assuming the premise here a little bit, which is that the United States government transmitted useful information to the Russians, which allowed them to conduct.
I absolutely do not believe that they transferred information. I think that they just put out a general warning, and then the Russians potentially acted upon that general warning. I do not think the Russians received any intel. I think the U.S. made it very clear that they were afraid to release intelligence because it might have compromised their sources, right?
Yeah. Yeah, sorry. I think I might have misunderstood you a little bit there. I mean, as far as I guess as far as the U.S. putting out a general warning, which cued the Russians into taking action, I mean, I don't think the Russians needed any prompting from the State Department to do a counterterrorism operation ahead of the elections. I think it was pretty clear that there was the Ukrainians would be, and they did try stuff, which the Russians disrupted most of it. In fact, the Russians disrupted pretty much everything that did occur prior to the elections. The successful attack, the Crocus City Hall attack, occurred afterwards and had apparently been postponed.
It was, and then this was another area that my suspicion was growing, was that the State Department warning came out at the exact same time that the Belgorod operation started. It seemed like way too overly coincidental for all of that to be happening right up against the presidential election, and right when Ukrainian and U.S. Officials had made, I don't know what you would call it.
In the warning that was put out, the travel warning was incredibly specific.
Yes.
The only thing that was mentioned was don't go to concerts.
Yeah, don't go to concerts. And there was a concert planned for that weekend, and then that attack didn't occur on that weekend.
And it wasn't just a concert; it was a concert by Shaman, who's a big Russian patriotic figure.
Yeah, he has a song "I'm Russian." Right?
Yeah. And he's a patriotic singer. He's a big supporter of Putin and so on. And he was performing at Crocus City Hall, 48 hours after that warning came out that there could be attacks on large gatherings, including concerts, in the next 48 hours. Which I said this at the time was when the attack went down, and sort of connecting the dots to this travel warning was, what did the U.S. government know and when did they know it? And because that was an extremely specific warning.
Yeah, and they
was very timely.
They had the. I mean, I have my sneaking suspicions about the whole thing. I think the U.S. knew a lot of information that they weren't telling. I think they put out that warning the same way they did in Iran, sort of what I consider a plausible deniability warning. We put it out. We had an intelligence that something might happen. We warned you. You didn't listen to our warning, so this happened, kind of deal. Do you guys think that the State Department was potentially involved, and not in the way that I think a lot of people are making it out to be, that that they organized it, they planned it, it was basically a U.S. attack on Russia? Not that so much, but more in that the State Department or the, whatever U.S. intelligence, CIA, whoever, had very, 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 very clear information, potentially knew that this attack was coming, potentially knew who was orchestrating this attack, and as we were just talking about Ukraine having their own free agency, do you think that the U.S. sort of put out this warning and then put their hands up like it wasn't us?
I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest. We know that we know the CIA has deep links to the GOR, is in active coordination with them. The same is true of MI6, and it's a. And I mean, this isn't the first time the Ukrainians have gone off the reservation. They've been doing it since the start of the war. We've passed them intelligence, told them not to act on it because this is just for informational, and they go ahead and God, back in very start of the war, they tried to assassinate Gerasimov. Yeah. Based on information I believe that they weren't even supposed to have. I think they sort of got it through a side channel with U.S. military intelligence, and they just went after him, even though we explicitly told them not to. So I mean, this is something they have a history of doing, and this sort of fits a pattern of the Ukrainian special services going off leash, and the American special services not being willing to take actions to prevent them from doing so because that relationship is that important. Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest if we had fairly detailed information on the attack.
Doctor?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is how much do they know, and were they actually actively involved in that? I can't say one way or the other if the CIA actually had anything to do with the planning of this, but it's basically the way that the denials came out right after it happened is it is totally covered my ass, right? Yep. We put that out there so we can just kind of pretend, whistle and pretend nothing had nothing to do with us.
And I want to know, by the way, that and I'm sorry for cutting over you, Snek, but as far as I recall, and maybe I've missed something, I don't necessarily follow what the State Department is putting out very closely, but as far as I recall, the United States has provided no information to refute Ukraine involvement in the attack. None. We've basically just put out a series of blanket statements saying this was definitely ISIS, guys. Trust us.
Right.
It's 2024. Right. That doesn't fly anymore.
Yeah, and if you know with such certainty, then why aren't we seeing the information, right?
If you're not involved, if you have all the information, you could have potentially prevented 140 civilian deaths. You chose not to because you were afraid of your sources. But are the Russians the Russians aren't closely knit with ISIS-K? I mean, they're not. I doubt that the Russians would expose those sources or ruin them. Especially if you help prevent a terror attack on Russian territory of this magnitude. None of it makes sense.
And in fact, I pointed this out earlier, which was I apologize, Snek, which was that because this warning that was allegedly transmitted to the Russians was ostensibly scrubbed for sources and methods. It was an unclassified warning, as near as I understand, totally public. Why can't what would clear this up immediately would be if the State Department released it. Just put it up on their website. This is what we told the Russians. They could let us decide if it was adequate.
Yeah. I mean, so all this is entirely suspicious, and we have no reason to believe the official cover story for this. So, yeah, I mean, pretty much, I think at this point we do have strong suspicion that Ukraine could legitimately had a hand in this, and whether or not they get the smoking gun, I think this goes back to your earlier point, Scott. It doesn't matter because Russians will believe what they want to believe about it, right? At this point, with Ukraine putting out stamps commemorating the attack, we might as well have done it. But you saw that, right? Yeah. Oh, your audio's off.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm under no illusion I have my perfectly clear idea of what happened. I just don't like to spout it because I don't have all of the evidence, and I'm making connections in my head, and I'm seeing illogical scenarios playing out, and I can't find the logic in it except through this one exact path. But I still don't like to, because I mean it's a bunch of civilians that got killed, so I like to sort of be neutral on the topic in terms of like, I'm not going to declare that it was one group or the other, but yeah, I have my suspicions. And like I said, I don't really believe it matters who did it. This is a good segue. We can actually get off of this 42-minute conversation about terror attacks. For the results of this terror attack seem to be infrastructure strikes. I'm curious as to your guys' thoughts. My thoughts on this is that these infrastructure strikes were planned way in advance. This has nothing to do with Belgorod. This has nothing to do with the oil refinery strikes. This has nothing to do with any terror attack or anything like that. This was a planned operation that is going ahead, and it's just the sort of the next step of the SMO. What are your guys' thoughts on the recent infrastructure strikes? We've seen HPPs and TPPs get taken out all over Ukraine. Substations are being targeted. I also want to hear your guys' thoughts on what the Russian goal in these infrastructure strikes are.
I guess I'll start. I actually don't. The thing about the infrastructure strikes is that the timing is quite interesting, because they didn't do this in winter, where it actually have the real like major effect, right? That says to me like there is something much more immediate, and I think that's the main reason why they're doing this, is to complicate logistics of the Ukrainian military on the left bank of the Dnieper, and this coincides with the current ongoing Russian offensive efforts. Right, if they can complicate your logistics, which are already kind of fucked on the Ukrainian side, they can actually, it basically makes things a lot easier for the Russian forces who are fighting in the Donbass and fighting up north near Kupiansk. So, I mean, the one thing to keep in mind though is that the de-energization will not be completely successful in like a strategic de-energization, because there are nuclear power plants in the west that Russia cannot touch, right? And Western Ukraine also has connection to the European grid, so they can import a certain amount if they fall below their power generation needs. And also, like, the Soviet grid was also massively redundant, and Ukraine only needs a fraction of that, because they have a much smaller population and also a much they have no industry left anymore, so they don't need the power for that. In the end, like, yeah, the west of Ukraine will have, I think, will have sufficient power. Even if they have to import it, I think Europe can supply a few gigawatts of power to make sure the Ukrainians have some. But what the infrastructure strikes are doing is like they're basically severing the connections and severing the power generation in the east of the country, where the current military operation is going. You see Kharkiv being a big focus of the current efforts, which makes me think that at some point there will be some kind of action plan in Kharkiv. I don't know if it's going to it's about taking the city, creating a buffer, whatever. But it is very. I think these like infrastructure strikes are very tactically focused, and they're not like strategic. Scott, your audio.
Armchair, go ahead. Sorry, I have to mute. I have a snoring dog right next to me.
That's adorable. Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. This was I pointed out before. There's the stars are kind of aligning for the Russians to take very significant action in spring summer 24, which is that the Ukrainians are Ukrainian casualties are becoming unsustainable. Their recruitment system they've become so heavy. Their recruitment system is not replacing casualties, and of course replacements are very low quality these days. Russian force build out has been continuing for a year and a half now, and they've generated very, very significant combat power, which we have not seen show up yet. And I mean, so yeah, we're at the point where the Russians are going to start looking at setting conditions for an offensive, I believe, and taking out the power certainly on the left bank of the Dnieper, and disrupting logistics in that cross Dnieper corridor is going to be I mean, that's a logical step, and it's just a logical step, and they're sort of proceeding apace. And I've also pointed this out, which is that the Russians don't really seem to do tit for tat retaliation. The retaliation is the fact there's a war on, and the Russians are going to achieve the objectives of the special military operation. And but why would you need to conduct retaliation for every little attack the enemy makes in a war? You just go and you win the war, and that's the big retaliation.
Yeah, winning the war is the retaliation.
You don't need to go I don't know, blow up Danilov's house or something in Kiev because the Russians, the Ukrainians blew up some refinery tower in Samara. Like that's pointless. Just go win the war.
So do you guys think that these infrastructure strikes are going to continue until the point where the Russians go on the offensive, and then the infrastructure strikes will stop once they, like you said, Doctor, that they're more of a tactical nature than a strategic nature? They're not necessarily trying to turn off the lights in Ukraine, because they're still going to be able to first off, they have nuclear power plants that are probably not going to be targeted in any way. They also have European power that can be piped in. So it's not so much about reducing the electricity. It's also not happening in the winter, which is a telltale sign of, what is potentially to come. As Doctor said, again, winter time would be the most effective time to do this, as we saw in 2022. Do you guys believe now, with these infrastructure strikes and with the Russian posturing, that there will be an offensive, some sort of larger scale offensive out, not just the normal attrition, small pushes sort of deal? Or do you think that there's going to be just a continuation of the battle that is happening right now, and this is more of just a way to complicate an already complicated logistics line for the Ukrainians?
I tend to believe this small pushes theory, just because I think a lot of the troops that people say are just hanging out doing nothing. I think they're in reserve for rotation, because we know the Russian troops are being rotated, unlike Ukrainian ones. So in this sense, it keeps the front line fresh and actually prevents exhaustion. And Russia has been very comfortable fighting at this pace. And eventually, when you have these problems that accumulate on the Ukrainian side, the front line is going to break, and you will see certain larger scale gains. But in this sense, I don't want people to get their hopes up that there will be some kind of big arrow. People have been selling the big arrow stuff for a long time, and we've constantly we thirst for it, but we never get it. So just keep your expectations tempered.
And I always like to reiterate this, that it doesn't necessarily benefit the Russians to do a large scale offensive. I mean, yes, capturing territory and moving the war along quicker definitely has its benefits, but with big arrow offensives, the battlefield becomes extremely fluid. Mistakes happen, casualties are much higher, and there can be reactions to events that are unpredictable. At least what you have right now, in terms of the overall strategic goal for the Russians is to win the war, right? And by doing what they're doing, they will eventually win. Over exaggerating or retaliating in a ridiculous manner, or whatever happens, can invite unnecessary risks to the current status of any given operation. Armchair, did you have something that you wanted to say about that? Not about what I just said.
Yes, I guess I'm going to I sort of disagree with the consensus here, which is that I've pointed out before, I believe the Russians have the ability to conduct a large offensive in 2024, a large and potentially very dramatic offensive. And I don't see any reason why they wouldn't do it. The status quo of simply keeping the war dragging along is, I mean, it's benefited Russia to an extent, but I think if the terror attack in Moscow actually showed anything, it was that the Russians cannot countenance a Ukraine to continue to exist under its current leadership. I think the actual the sort of retaliation, I guess you could call it, for that attack would actually be the escalation of Russian war goals to at a minimum regime change in Kiev. And in order to get regime change, and as long as the war is going on, well, NATO aid is still going to go into Ukraine to some extent. NATO will continue to use Ukraine as a boxing glove to attack Russian assets. And I mean, the war has to end sometime. And I believe the conditions are pretty well set for the Russians to end the war, for the Russians to take decisive action to end the war, possibly this year. And I realize that I realize that, this has been a war which has been very static thus far, but that, like they say in investing, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I actually don't agree with that fundamentally, because I think in the best of all possible worlds, like if Russia wanted to and was able to, they would do the bigger air offensive and march all the way back to Kiev again. But it's just, it is a combination of certain, I guess, a mentality of sorts that Russia is very comfortable doing what they're doing at the front right now. And this is the pattern they've established. And there's not really that imperative to change things, because they're seeing what we're doing here is working, that the Ukrainians don't have the force capability the force generation capability to resist our pushes anymore. And we're just pushing. It might take a little while, but if we do it, we can just take, another village every week. This kind of, it might be complacent thinking, but it's working. And once you get kind of set in that mode, it becomes difficult to do something different, right? Which is, this is getting into just we can't talk about this definitively or anything like that. But so far, what we've seen with the Russian units and the way that they've conducted frontline operations, it's these small probing attacks that try to conserve manpower, right? They try to infiltrate frontline positions through using cover through tree lines, right? Often using 1, 2, 3 tanks as fire support to cover an infantry landing. These are all very small scale tactical pushes, but once you add them up, they begin to erode an entire front line. In order to actually have large scale operations, I think you actually would have to see a real doctrinal reorganization and form actual maneuver brigades that are capable of just doing that large scale exploitation attack. I just don't think we're seeing that kind of organization on the Russian side, though theoretically, if they wanted to spend time reorganizing, they probably could. But it's just what they're doing right now seems to be working, and it seems like people at all levels seem to have accepted that, right?
No, and I'll also point out that the Russians are going to want to forestall a official NATO deployment into Ukraine, because Macron made his comments a couple of weeks ago, and he got a lot of pushback on that. But this isn't the first time we've seen somebody in NATO float a trial balloon and everybody yell at them, and then 6 months later, that's the status quo.
Yeah, I have some more information about that, actually. The reason why NATO's freaking out isn't just it. It's not just a trial balloon by Macron. There's an actual pressing need for specialists, because what you actually did see over the last few months is a bunch of these artillery and SAM crews getting killed. So they're actually kind of the losses that Ukraine has, they can replace frontline meat. You can get a guy who's been trained for 2 weeks and you throw him in the frontline trench, but that specialist who's a radar operator, who is artillerist, those guys take a long time to train, and those guys are getting killed off. And where are you going to get the skilled personnel? You're not going to get them in Ukraine, right? So this is actually in terms of the think tankies and what they're talking about. Ukraine desperately needs specialists, and Macron just kind of let the cat out of the bag because he wanted to do this in a legal way by having an actual deployment, right? Instead of just doing this clandestine. Because if you do it clandestine, you can't. Soldiers may not necessarily collect death benefits for their families. and nobody wants to fucking jump in that shithole. So,
and what the Russians very much do not want to see is, because as I pointed out earlier, the existence of a Ukrainian state under its current leadership post-war is poisonous for the Russian Federation, because they're just going to keep on doing terror attacks. They're going to rearm to whatever extent they can. It's going to be packed with NATO troops. It's going to be a continuing bleeding sore in the right on Russia's borders, unless there is at a minimum regime change in Kiev. And what the Russians very much do not want to see is a sort of Syrianization of the conflict, where you see exactly what's happened in Syria, where Western forces moved in, Turkish and American forces moved in to protect defeated proxies and to sort of lock in territorial losses for the Syrian government, and sort of use their presence on the ground to force it to sort of freeze the conflict by force, because nobody wants to start World War III over goddamn Syria. What the Russians very much do not want to see is this happening in Ukraine, on their border, in a very important part of the world for them. And so, I mean, I guess I'm having a hard time seeing how they prevent this without taking fairly dramatic action.
Recent statements by officials, particularly out of Russia. We saw the famous diplomat in France, has a last name that everybody knows.
Was it Tolstoy?
Yeah, Tolstoy. He basically said to a French reporter that if French troops are sent to Ukraine, they will be struck immediately. Is this posturing by Russia? I have serious doubts that Russia would actually strike these troops. I mean, they've said similar things in the past. I'm not saying that they wouldn't, strike these troops. Like, they're in the general area, they might get hit. But are they going to go out of their way to deliberately target French citizens if they are sent to the country? Or is this sort of just a posturing thing where, you're trying to call Macron's bluff so he doesn't actually send troops, because obviously that would not be beneficial for Russia in their SMO?
Well, I think this is one of those things we don't know. Like, they keep on saying this, and we just don't know if they're going to do it or not, because Russia is like, in the beginning, like, they hit that mercenary training camp, right? Killed like 200 people. And that was like a huge sign, the wake up call that got a lot of the mercenaries to actually leave the fight. But then the mercenaries came back, right? And Russia then again at various instances did go out of their way to hit them, but it wasn't like. But there's still a lot of these mercs inside Ukraine. So all this is like, will they? Yeah, will they do it as a one-off and then it won't matter? Like, there's so many different factors to consider. I don't think we can definitively say one or the other. I do think though that this idea, like, they're going to be instantly struck by like 15 Kinzhals and like vaporized, I think that's not going to happen. I think because I think the risk of just instant nuclear escalation, if that happens, potentially is like, I think Putin's shown himself to be a much more cautious, for better or for worse, cautious and rational actor.
One last question, I guess. For this should probably run us until an hour 30, maybe. Do you guys, the recent statements by the director of the FSB, he talked about, obviously, Ukraine's involvement. He made a series of statements, and then he goes on to say that Budanov is now a legitimate target for the Russian Federation in Ukraine. I'm curious as to your guys' thoughts. Does this mean that all leadership is a target, or is this just because he is acting head of the SBU, who almost seems like they're going to be considered a terrorist organization by the Russian government? Armchair, you're saying that basically this current regime cannot exist in Ukraine for Russia to, be safe and have a decent post-war, world to live in. Do you think that now actors like Zelensky and Zelensky's administration are also going to become targets, or is this just limited to the intelligence agency for now?
Well, I think the Russians have been quite clear they're going to pursue and do what they need to do with the people responsible for the attack on Moscow last week, and they've certainly pointed the finger very strongly at the Ukrainian special services. Now, I think as far as your specific question, I think that the people that they're game on, so to speak, right now for our the leader, or the members of those special services. I don't necessarily think that this extends to the civilian members of the regime at this point. Simply because we haven't seen them talking about it. If Putin said, I'd just get rid of Zelensky now, that would I think we would have heard about it.
Yeah, the thing about Budanov, he's actually become quite the little octopus in the Ukrainian state. I mean, he's technically a military leader, but he does have his finger in a lot of pies now. His support for Zelensky actually got him quite a bit of power. And for example, I'm told that the conscription efforts and the efforts to sort of digitize the conscription database with the bank account numbers and all that shit, that effort is overseen by him. Right, he's one of the main proponents behind the scenes, and his GUR actually gets first pick of Western weapons transfers. They oversee that as well. So he's despite just having a military presence, he still has his fingers in a lot of agencies and a lot of institutions inside the Ukrainian government. He is essentially a power broker at this point. So in saying that Budanov is a target, I mean, he is very much probably the most hardcore member, the most hardcore nationalist within Zelensky's circle. And getting rid of him, I guess, would be a boon. But I would also caution against reading it too much into recent statements. I think they try to get him before. They try to kill him before, and for a while people thought he was dead, but they didn't get him, right? So I think he was a legitimate target before. It's just that he hides very well. I mean, he must have all kinds of bunkers or safe houses that he can hide in, and he's certainly not going to reveal himself and make himself a target to be hit. Right. I mean, this is the case, by the way. What recently happened with the Kiev strike, and people were saying, "Oh, a bunch of GOR and SBU got hit, and we can celebrate." Well, they hit the civil defense building, and it turns out that civil defense building was actually a drone factory. It was one of those garages where you have a bunch of people assembling FPVs by hand. It's not an insignificant target, but in terms of getting GUR and SBU, they're not in the official buildings. They're totally dispersed. They're not going to be easy to hit.
Yeah, you're not usually going to find Budanov or whoever sitting in a building that's labeled civil defense, SBU, something like that, on Google Maps. The strikes, I always think the strikes that are the most important are the ones that you never see. The strikes inside Kiev, the strikes that are in city centers are not usually the most important. The strikes that you never get a video of, the ones that you never get a picture of because there's some isolated military installation that gets struck, whether it's ammunition, whether it's an air defense system, whatever it is. Usually we don't get that footage. The footage we get is, a power plant or something getting hit. So I do tend to agree with you on that this strike was not at a decision-making center. I know, Doctor, you talked to me specifically about this in a DM when it happened, and my whole thing was never that it wasn't that it was like a decision-making center or an SBU, that high-level individuals were taken out. That was never my claim. I've stopped claiming that entirely for everything. I don't. When I hear NATO, NATO in a bunker got hit, this, that, and the other decision-making center, you'll know it when it happens, and I don't think it's happened yet. So. I do tend to agree with you. The only argument that I was making was that this was not a civilian building. They were saying it was the Women's Design College, which was the building right next to it.
Yeah, they're doing handicrafts with assembly FPVs.
Yeah, it is a form of art, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, but actually the way that the information came through the information stream, that was actually kind of interesting, because Masno, the telegrammer, right? He's a guy in Ukraine running a Zero-Gram, but he was basically saying like, my guy on the ground saying, oh, the SVU got hit. They were like actually had a celebration there. For whatever reason, why were they having a party at the building? I don't get it. But he said like his sources on the ground told him that. So what it means is that SBU has infiltrated his data stream. Right? They had a guy basically call up Masno saying like, oh, SBU got hit hard. That was an SPU guy telling him that.
Yeah. Right.
So yeah, the way the information ops like that the Ukrainians run, I mean, they are quite sophisticated. And they have their fingers in a lot of pies.
Yeah, and this goes both ways as well, because there was that whole – I mean, we saw the same thing with that Russian telegrammer that got – he faked his own death, basically. He put ketchup on his mouth to make himself look dead. And then he came out a couple hours later and said that this didn't happen. So, yeah, I'm always very, very cautious with any claims like that. Any magnificent claims I'm always very cautious with. Gerasimov, Shoigu, Bunanov, Zelensky, these people they don't seem to be getting particularly targeted in any significant way. So I'm always very careful with that.
Oh, we have an interesting comment in the chat I saw, which is that I've been reading Telegram here, but apparently the Bears are back up and they're flying towards launch positions right now. So it looks like we're in for another round of strikes. Yeah,
that makes 7 Tu-95 strikes in 14 days.
Yeah. The Russians, I think, are hitting about as fast as they can, service the bombers and put new missiles on them.
Let's see. Oh, yep, 6. 6 just went up. All right. I got to make a post. Do you guys – so – I was curious. Do you think that there's going to be a real muddy season this year? I'm looking at the terrain. Does it? I don't specifically remember it's like raining particularly hard in April. In April of 2023, I don't remember it. I remember that the winter of 2022, 2023 was much more difficult. There was a lot more snow. It just doesn't. The ground does not seem soft at all, like it was. After February 2022 when the Russians went in. Are the ground conditions, I'm not that you guys would particularly know this off the top of your head, but it doesn't appear to me like the ground conditions are bad. And it seems like that could very much benefit the Russians in, whatever offensive operations they have planned for April, May, June.
I mean, we certainly saw that Challenger 2 turn into a submarine. I think ground conditions can be a little bit deceiving.
Yeah, that is very true. I do think that was in the West, though, wasn't it? There's no challenge.
Yeah, it was in training area. Yeah, it didn't have chevrons on, so it was like, just a training. They're just training with it. And
which, by the way, how shitty are those tanks that they can't even? They sent the Abrams, they sent the Leopards. We've seen more Abrams in combat that were received 6 months after the Challengers came than Challengers. Like how bad did those? How bad? What shape are those tanks in? Because
I think the most embarrassing thing is that the 1 or 2, it's unclear, got blown up, and then the British panicked because they have this. The British have like this cult of machinery, I'd almost call it, around the Challenger 2 of being this incredible tank when it's kind of a mediocre design, and. They apparently issue, or seem to at least have told the Ukrainians to pull them all off the front line. I mean, meanwhile, we've seen Leopards and now Abrams being used in combat routinely.
Yeah, but
I mean, it's
one
deeply
thing I would
embarrassing.
say is that one thing I'd say this is I don't knock the fact that they're using these tanks and they're getting blown up, because I mean if you look at what happened to Leopards, like they're all like we only saw actually a dozen to 20 or so Leopards actually get destroyed on camera. But it seems like they lost almost all of them because they're just broken. They're broken down. Like they blew their engines. They threw track. Like they couldn't. All these things can happen to heavy machinery, and because the Ukrainians can't actually repair anything in the field, so it's like you use it or lose it, right? And I think in using these tanks, at least they're doing tank things. They're doing things that tanks should do instead of just sitting back and sinking in mud or just blowing an engine and just being abandoned on the side of the road. I mean, they're actually legitimately trying to fight. And I think, yeah, in some sense, like people laugh because these vehicles are getting blown up, but like tanks are meant to be used. I mean, war is war, right? You can't for whatever it's worth, like it is an attempt to actually use the equipment in the way, at least, that it was actually designed, right? Instead of just driving around and just having it break down.
Oh, I totally agree. I've never understood this. We saw it in the counteroffensive. Obviously, there was disagreements about what was supposed to happen in the counteroffensive, even within the Ukrainian government. They went in multiple different directions. They never committed anywhere specifically. But the whole time I was looking at this, and my prediction for that counteroffensive was that they would break through, they would reach Tokmak, that area, and then that they would get slowed and bogged down there. But at least that would be something that they could turn into, a win, whatever you want to call it. They never committed. I mean, the Challengers were never committed in any significant way. The Leopards were never committed in any significant way. I think we've seen more Leopards committed at like Pobieda and Turney in the LPR, and Pobieda right north of Novomihailovka and south of Avdiivka than we saw in the counteroffensive. Like, I know we had that one pile up, we had that one instance, and then we had a few more Leopards and Bradleys get picked off here and there throughout the counteroffensive. But really, they stopped using them and they just went directly into, infantry attacks. So I completely agree that it is nice to actually see the Ukrainians using the equipment that they were given for its intended purpose instead of it just being like the Challenger. The Challenger has to be one of the biggest jokes of this entire conflict, just in the fact that it was used once, it got instantly destroyed, and then it's just been like this propaganda thing where they have two working Challengers in the back that they use for training. It's very interesting to me. Did you guys have any other topics that you wanted to touch on?
I mean, not really. I mean, this is unless you have any other topics.
No, I've covered the three things that I specifically wanted to dive into. Armchair, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Nothing I can think of off the top of my head. Let me look at my feed here actually and see if I have any brainwaves I'd like to sort of mention on stream. But I think it's your show.
If you guys have any schizo, comments you want to make, now's the time. Throw them in.
Oh, did you see the photos that came out the other day of the Russians taking that Storm Shadow apart?
Oh yeah, just on the side of the road with a wrench.
Literally like a freaking Chinese socket wrench set, and I was making jokes that they were going to steal our Torx head technology now.
Dude, it's so funny that he's over there pulling it apart like it's some like craft hobby. He's like, "Oh, I love taking these apart. I just kind of do it sometimes."
Yeah, it's like a guy working on his car.
Did you guys also see that the 110th Territorial Defense Brigade is now the 100th Mechanized Brigade?
Oh, they upgraded it?
They just, is that how that works? Can you just?
That happens the whole time in war. It happens all the time. Like if they actually get new equipment, like they get more vehicles, then they can just so they're mechanized because they have more vehicles.
Do you think that's what happened though?
I mean, we have to see what vehicles they got. It might just be Toyotas. I mean, we don't know.
Yeah, is this because this what this feels like? The timing of this feels like they just made a mechanized brigade out of a territorial defense brigade because they don't have enough mechanized units anymore.
Oh yeah, but that reminds me. By the way, there's actually a new line of like Russian anti-air vehicles coming out, and they're actually going to be like truck mounted, like 23 millimeter and 14.5s, and basically they're truck mounted machine guns for anti-drone work.
Yeah, which is smart. The Ukrainians have been doing that for a while now.
Yeah, and you can crank these out. You can crank these out all over the front, so basically every unit will have a few of these covering them.
Did you? I was listening to it was on one of the Ukrainian telegrams, and they were talking about how the Ukrainians ended up tracking all of the Guarantee drones. Basically, they just set up like 8,000 microphones across the entire country. That's and bullshit. They can just like triangulate where the noise is coming from.
Yeah, that is such bullshit.
Do you think that is bullshit?
That's really cheesy.
Is it? See, I don't know enough. It sounded legitimate to me, but
I mean, it's going to. How would I put it? I think it would give you an approximate location of where the drones are and where they're heading. I don't think it's going to allow you to target them very effectively.
Yeah,
certainly if they're saying we're able to shoot these things down because of that, I don't think that's meritorious, particularly because Garand attacks almost invariably happen at night, and the kind of AAA they're talking about is pretty much optically guided and very old. So. Yeah. And also, I mean, we like the Ukrainians claim constantly they shoot down all these Garands, and we never see them do it. They never release video. If the Ukrainians were having all these successful air defense operations, they'd post video constantly.
This is a very, very true statement, because the only time I see Guarantees actually go down, I think I've seen one or two that the Ukrainians have claimed were electronic warfare. I can't disprove that happened. They were intact, so whatever. But the only time I see them get shot down is by interceptor missiles. I've never one time seen
a Gepard shoot one down. That was like the only successful interceptor.
I've also potentially may have seen one of those. Yeah,
I mean, I've seen them get like damaged by small arms fire before and go off target. Like I think that was like the first big Garand attack. There was one that sort of one off target. It'd been shot at by small arms.
Yeah, it's very difficult to actually kill a Garand just with machine gun fire, because you hit the wings are inert. You just put holes in the wings.
Yeah,
and it can still fly. It just might go off course, but it can still fly.
It's why it works, right? Is because you can basically beat them to all hell. It's like a sail on a boat. You can you can shoot a sailboat sail a couple times, and it's not gonna. It'll still sail. So
yeah. I mean, unless you blow the wing off, or the engine is basically a block of steel,
or you hit the warhead.
Yeah, which is why you actually need something like a Sea Whiz or like a autocannon, right? That kind of the proximity fuses to blow up as many put as much shrapnel on target in hopes of hitting the charge.
So we're bringing 88s back. Is that what we're talking about?
I mean, 30 millimeter and 23 millimeter. That's a start. But you really are going to eventually see close in air defense use basically Sea Whiz. Like you have
I was thinking potentially a more viable option, and the direction that everybody's already heading in. Could you just do interceptor drones that you?
Oh yeah,
relay.
Yeah.
In fact, I saw a
cost-effective option for these slow-moving drones.
Yeah,
I saw a post recently. The Russians had begun deploying interceptor drones.
Yeah, I mean, if you follow the Geopolitics Air Show and other major trade shows for aviation arms, you would have seen these anti-drone drones being shown off in the last couple of years.
Yeah,
this is what actually where stuff is heading. The kind of stuff that people are talking about, the Ukraine predicting the future of warfare. It's like it's true to an extent, but what you're seeing really are the first glimpses of what next generation warfare is going to be, and that's going to be our drone swarm fighting your drone swarm, right? The 5 kilometers of the line of contact is going to be 2 drone swarms battling each other and seeing which side can overwhelm the other, and then therefore open up the people to attack.
So you think that it would be more drone versus drone instead of, because what I've always thought is that we're going to start to see an arms race, and I could be completely wrong in this. I don't have much experience in this realm, so this is just me, coming up with ideas. But what could we potentially see, like large AOE signal disruption?
Well, that's why you have AI autonomy on those drones eventually, so they can operate individually even if they're cut off from home base.
Yeah. Is there any electronic warfare that bypasses that, when it's not just signal interruption, but actually messes with the drone itself?
I mean, then you're looking at directed energy weapons.
Okay, so right. that's a whole. There is.
Then you're frying the thing.
I was thinking more like a 100 by 100 kilometer area that you can basically make inert to both your drones and the enemy's drones. Like make this.
Well, it doesn't affect autonomous weapons.
Okay.
Like weapons that can think for themselves, like they can continue to operate even if they're complete cut off.
Because it's all about signal interruption, right? That makes sense. Yeah.
Right. So basically, this area between the 2 armies is going to be pretty wide in the future, like 5-10 kilometers, and then they'll be populated largely by these autonomous systems. Right.
It's going to be that's going to be the craziest thing to see when you just see 100 drones in one swarm battling 100 drones in another swarm. It's just to think about.
Right. I mean, this is also figuring to like air combat, where now like everybody's developing these wingman drones that are going to be like meat shields for the actual humans, right?
Yeah. All right, that takes us to 1 hour and 23 minutes. I think that this was a very successful roundtable. Thank you, Dr. Snek, and thank you, Armchair Warlord. You guys are a breath of fresh air for my chat and my viewers. They get tired of listening to me. You guys are much, much, much more qualified to talk on these things. So I definitely appreciate you coming on. Again, this invitation is always extended to you guys in the future. You are always welcome to come on any roundtable that you see being hosted. Thank you so much for everybody listening in. Make sure you guys go and follow Dr. Snek and Armchair Warlord on Twitter. You can just search their names. That's exactly how they're presented on the screen in front of you. Go give them a follow. They are fantastic. I've been following both of them since basically the beginning of the SMO, and they have been fantastic. Did you have something to say, Snek?
No, I'm fine.
Oh, okay. I would also like to just extend a appreciation to the 7,500 people we had watch live today. You guys are fantastic. Honestly, this doesn't happen without you, and you guys are amazing. Be sure to tune in. If there's a strike tonight, I will be definitely doing a live stream tomorrow. So tune in for that. And thank you guys. Thank you, Doctor. And thank you, Armchair, for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Until next time, guys. Take care. Have a safe weekend and enjoy Easter.